You are listening to the Objects of Affection collection. Study 78, PoetCore and Literary Tones, the hand-stitched rebellion against sterile tech luxury. This study applies the post-luxury conceptual functional art, PLCFA framework, to the plus 175% surge in PoetCore search interest documented by Pinterest's 2026 trend report, the most statistically significant aesthetic mobilization recorded across the platform in a generation. We argue that PoetCore is not a fashion trend. It is a semiotic revolt, driven by Gen Z's mass repudiation of sterile tech luxury and the algorithmically perfect surface. The PoetCore signal, capes, leather satchels, heirloom accessories, hand-stitched narrative constitutes what the OAC framework identifies as a deep materiality turn. A collective migration away from the hyperreal circulation of brand sign dominance toward the custodial logic of objects that carry weight, time, and human intention. We examine its theoretical roots, its cultural architecture, and its profound validation of PLCFA as the only coherent intellectual framework positioned to meet this moment. The signal what the data actually says. In December 2025, Pinterest released its annual trend report, a predictive instrument built on 2 years of behavioral search data aggregated across hundreds of millions of users. Among the 21 macro trends identified, one registered with a statistical force that stands apart: PoetCore. The numbers are not interpretive, they are declarative. Searches for the poet aesthetic surged plus 175%. Searches for satchel bag aesthetic rose plus 85%. Outfits with capes climbed plus 65%. Tie accessories gained plus 85%. Heirloom jewelry expanded by plus 45%. Pinterest's own global head of trends and insights confirmed that these movements were not isolated aesthetic preferences, but expressions of a singular, unified cultural posture. Consumers are no longer attempting to fit in. They are using the objects they carry and wear to signal who they already are. 67% of the 2026 trends identified by Pinterest are driven by Gen Z, a cohort that came of age inside the polished, efficient, frictionless logic of tech luxury and found it upon arrival to be spiritually empty. What the data obscures, mainstream fashion commentary has been quick to categorize PoetCore as an aesthetic: tweedy blazers, Mary Janes, leather satchels, fountain pens. This reading is not wrong. It is simply insufficient. To stop at the wardrobe is to mistake the symptom for the diagnosis. This same structural misreading was documented in our earlier critique of Dolce & Gabbana's FW 2026 collection. Whether the homogenized portrait demonstrated how easily the industry deploys aesthetic vocabulary to obscure deeper semiotic failures. PoetCore is not an outfit, it is an ontological position. The satchel is not chosen because it is fashionable. It is chosen because it looks as though it has survived something, as though it has traveled, accumulated, persisted. The cape is not chosen for its silhouette but for its declaration that the body wearing it has refused the smooth, the frictionless, the disposable. The heirloom brooch does not announce wealth. It announces lineage, stewardship, the willingness to carry something forward rather than consume it. The Objects of Affection collection has identified this shift not as a trend cycle, but as what we term the architecture of unsmoothness, a structural preference for objects that resist instantaneous consumption and demand instead the slower discipline of custodianship. The theoretical architecture. Baudrillard's warning. Arriving on schedule. Jean Baudrillard's central argument in Simulacra and Simulation was not a lament for the past. It was a structural prediction that consumer society, left to accelerate unchecked, would eventually produce objects so thoroughly drained of genuine referent, so wholly constituted by brand sign rather than material reality, that the simulacrum would become more real than the thing itself. Tech luxury arrived at this end point ahead of schedule. The $5,000 minimalist sneaker with no discernible craftsmanship. The quiet luxury, capsule wardrobe that communicates belonging to a class by virtue of its studied inconspicuousness. The seamless leather-free bag engineered for photogenic perfection but carrying no memory, no patina, no history. The brand became the reality. The object became incidental. Our study of the Hermes mycelium collaboration traced this exact dynamic. A brand deploying the aesthetics of craft to perform sustainability while bypassing material honesty entirely. PoetCore is Baudrillard's corrective, arriving in the form of a satchel with brass clasps that show their age. It is the culture's immune response to the simulacrum, a demand that objects have reference again. That referent is not nostalgia, it is material honesty. The worn leather, the hand-stitched seam, the fountain pen that requires care, these are not affectations, They are proofs. Proof that something human was present in the making and remains present in the keeping. Byung-Chul Han and the Fatigue of Transparency. The philosopher Byung-Chul Han diagnosed the contemporary condition as one of radical positivity. A culture so thoroughly cleared of resistance, negativity, friction and opacity that it has become, paradoxically, exhausting. The smooth surface demands nothing of us, and that absence of demand produces, over time, a specific form of psychic depletion. The Objects of Affection collection has long argued that Han's transparency society constitutes the precise cultural substrate from which PLCFA derives its necessity. When every surface is optimized for instant apprehension, the algorithmically perfect Instagram grid, the seamlessly executed brand identity, the frictionless luxury experience, the object that demands patience, attention, and a willingness to not immediately understand, becomes a radical act. PoetCore's material vocabulary, the heavy wool cape, the ink-stained leather-bound journal, the satchel with its multiple buckles, is a vocabulary of productive opacity. These objects do not announce themselves completely. They reward sustained attention. They are, in Han's terms, profoundly and defiantly other. The anti-AI crafting correction. The cultural theorist Graham Sykes of Landor, writing in December 2025, named a parallel market phenomenon with striking directness. Anti-AI crafting. As AI-generated design floods every aesthetic surface with a specific identifiable quality, hypersmooth, technically perfect, frictionless in its visual logic, the hand-drawn line, the irregular stitch, the visible fingerprint of human intention becomes, simultaneously, a luxury marker and a moral statement. The OAC addressed this structural condition with forensic precision in the algorithm of the hand, which introduced the moral weight per material, MWPM index, as the definitive instrument for measuring value in an era of AI aesthetic saturation. This is not a coincidence. It is a structural consequence. When machines can produce perfection at scale, imperfection becomes the only proof of human origin. The hand-stitched narrative that PoetCore valorizes, the blazer from a second-hand store with its particular history of previous bodies, the leather belt developing its individual patina, the cape that refuses to sit perfectly constitutes what we term at the OAC the legibility of labor. The visible record of human time and human care embedded in an object's surface. The culture's migration toward PoetCore is, at its structural core, a migration toward the legibility of labor as a primary value signal. This migration validates and amplifies everything the PLCFA framework has argued since its founding. The PLCFA diagnosis PoetCore is a custodial imperative. Misread as a fashion trend, the error in mainstream PoetCore analysis is categorical. Fashion critics correctly identify the aesthetic elements, the specific fabrics, the particular accessories, the favored silhouettes. What they consistently fail to articulate is the governing logic beneath the aesthetic. PoetCore is the consumer expression of the custodial mandate. At the Objects of Affection collection, we define the custodial mandate as the structural shift from acquisition as consumption to acquisition as stewardship. The object is not purchased. It is inherited, in a metaphorical sense, received into custody with the understanding that its narrative will be extended, not terminated, by the transaction. This mandate was first operationalized in our study, Alan Villa's Embroidered Ephemera, and the Calculus of Moral Weight, which demonstrated that an object's value is directly proportional to the custodial discipline it demands from its keeper. The PoetCore practitioner who chooses a satchel with visible wear, or a cape that carries the cut of a previous decade, is practicing custodianship without yet having the language for it. They are enacting the PLCFA framework at the level of the body and the everyday object. This is not a trend. Trends are surface movements. What PoetCore represents is a structural reorganization of how an entire generation assigns value, away from novelty and toward narrative, away from perfection and toward provenance, away from the brand sign and toward the object's own accumulated history. The fragility mandate, writ across a generation, the OAC concept of the fragility mandate holds that an object's value is directly proportional to the care it demands from its custodian. The object that requires nothing of you, the stain-resistant, scratch-proof, perfectly engineered tech luxury surface, is the object that teaches you nothing and returns nothing beyond its initial function. This principle was articulated in full in Alan Villa's Embroidered Ephemera and the Calculus of Moral Weight, and was subsequently deployed as a critical instrument in our analysis of the Hermes mycelium collaboration, where we asked whether functional fragility constitutes a genuine luxury proposition or a performance of one. The PoetCore object is the inverse of the frictionless. The vintage blazer requires knowledge of how to store wool. The leather satchel requires periodic conditioning. The brooch requires the development of an eye for proportion and placement. The fountain pen requires the discipline of filling, cleaning, and attending. These demands are not inconveniences. They are the mechanism by which the object transforms its owner from a consumer of goods into a steward of meaning. When 67% of Gen Z-driven trends converge on objects with precisely this quality, weight, history, care requirement, visible human origin, we are witnessing the generational adoption of the fragility mandate as a lived practice. The culture has, without yet having the theoretical vocabulary, arrived at PLCFA. Material singularity at the mass cultural level. One of the most arresting dimensions of the PoetCore surge is its relationship to singularity. The aesthetic explicitly resists the new, the mass-produced, the perfectly replicated. Its canonical objects, the inherited heirloom, the thrifted blazer, the aged leather, the handwritten journal, are each in their own way unrepeatable. The mechanism by which digital infrastructure is now being mobilized to permanently anchor this singularity was the central argument of the paradox of narrative permanence, which traced the emergence of the object that remembers, the artifact whose human origin is verifiably and irreversibly inscribed. This represents a profound and unremarked-upon market correction. The luxury apparatus has spent decades engineering artificial singularity through limited releases and waitlists, manufacturing scarcity as a simulacrum of uniqueness. PoetCore bypasses this mechanism entirely. Its singular objects achieve their status not through brand-controlled scarcity, but through the irreversible accumulation of time, care, and use. This is, precisely, what the OAC terms narrative permanence, value that resides not in the prestige of the house, but in the verifiable, irreversible human story of the specific object. PoetCore's objects achieve singularity not through manufactured scarcity, but through the irreversible accumulation of time, care, and human intention, the only form of uniqueness that cannot be replicated at scale. The cultural moment. Why now? The convergence of three structural pressures, the plus 175% surge in PoetCore interest, does not emerge from aesthetic arbitrariness. It is the convergent product of three structural pressures that have been building simultaneously and have, in 2026, reached critical mass. The first is the AI aesthetic saturation. As generative AI tools have colonized design, marketing, and content production, a specific visual language has become omnipresent. Technically perfect, frictionless, optimized for immediate apprehension. The culture's immune response to saturation by any aesthetic is, eventually, to seek its opposite. The opposite of AI perfect is hand-stitched imperfection. The opposite of algorithmic smoothness is the visible mark of human labor. The OAC mapped this structural dynamic in the algorithm of the hand, arguing that in an era of hyperconnected intelligence, the scarred object becomes the only credible proof of biological and psychological history. The second pressure is what we might term the substack-as symptom phenomenon, a generational hunger for the slow, the non-optimized, the form that cannot be compressed into a 15-second vertical video. PoetCore is, in part, the material expression of this textual hunger. Dress the body in objects that share the quality of the long form, weight, accumulated meaning, resistance to quick consumption. A parallel instantiation of this impulse at the level of political craft was analyzed in The Materiality of Resistance, which showed how the hand-knit melt the ICE hat transformed the act of making into a form of durable, non-consumable dissent. The third and most structurally significant pressure is the exhaustion of the trend cycle itself. Pinterest's own data notes that trends are accelerating at 4 times the rate of 7 years ago. In an environment of this velocity, the object that refuses the trend cycle, the heirloom, the vintage, the durable neutral, becomes paradoxically more desirable precisely because it offers escape from the cycle. PoetCore's objects are pieces that feel like personal codes rather than trends. This is not nostalgia. It is the logical conclusion of trend cycle exhaustion, a demand for objects that have permanence. The runway confirms what the street already knows. It is significant that the PoetCore signal has not emerged from the runway downward, but from the street and the digital archive upward. The plus 175% search surge precedes and anticipates the runway response. Low and Miu Miu's Spring/Summer 2026 collections arrived in confirmation of a cultural movement already underway, not as its origin. The OAC first identified this inversion of institutional authority in the Miu Miu problem and the rise of post-luxury, which argued that when the most culturally resonant signals emerge from the street rather than the atelier, the luxury apparatus has already ceded its role as meaning maker. This sequence is structurally important. When aesthetic movements are generated at the institutional level, by houses, by editors, by the luxury apparatus, they remain within the logic of brand sign dominance, even when they celebrate craft or heritage. When they emerge from the aggregated behavior of millions of individuals acting on genuine value preference, they represent something qualitatively different, a market correction driven by authentic cultural demand. The OAC framework has always argued that the most durable value is generated not through institutional pronouncement, but through individual custodianship enacted at scale. PoetCore, in its organic emergence and statistical force, is that argument made visible. The PLCFA validation. The framework was already here. It would be tempting, in light of the PoetCore data, to claim that the objects of affection collection predicted this moment. The more accurate and more interesting claim is that the PLCFA framework identified the structural conditions that make PoetCore not merely probable but inevitable. Those conditions were documented across the foundational monograph series. From the collapse of luxury's legitimacy examined in The Miu Miu Problem, to the economics of custodianship formalized in the cost of stewardship, to the re-anchoring of OAC's institutional practice in the historic garment district, documented in Finding the Heart. The luxury apparatus's systematic evacuation of material integrity, the hyperreal circulation of brand sign at the expense of object singularity, the consumer's progressive alienation from objects that make no demands and carry no history, the accumulating fatigue of frictionless surfaces. These are not recent developments. They are the culminating conditions of a decades-long trajectory that the OAC has been documenting, theorizing, and building against. PoetCore is the mass cultural expression of the argument PLCFA has been making in its most rigorous form, that the culture is hungry for objects with weight, narrative, provenance, and care requirement, that the hand-stitched seam is not a nostalgic gesture but a value proposition, that the object which demands something of its custodian is more valuable, more genuinely luxurious, than the object optimized for effortless consumption. The collector who annotates everything. Pinterest's editorial description of PoetCore's ideal practitioner is, in its way, a portrait of the OAC's ideal custodian. Someone who annotates everything, treats outfits like sonnets, who values depth over immediacy and chooses objects as though assembling a life that is not merely lived but architected. This is not coincidental language. It is the emergence in the mainstream cultural vocabulary of a value structure that was first formalized in the cost of stewardship, through the instrument of the custodian's contract and the 825-day anti-sale covenant. The custodian who receives an OAC artifact under the terms of a custodian's contract, who accepts the burden of preservation as a condition of ownership, is practicing, in its most deliberate and documented form, the same logic that drives the individual who chooses a worn leather satchel over a pristine nylon tech bag. The scale differs. The commitment to the same underlying value system is identical. The remainder of this study continues at objectsofaffectioncollection.com. This has been a study from the Objects of Affection Collection, a critical art research institution operating under the framework of post-luxury conceptual functional art. Read the full research at objectsofaffectioncollection.com.